The modern world has entered into a dark age of rhetoric. Modernity preaches science, trusting pure dialectic is the holy road to perfect knowledge. Instead of, we all believe in one true God, as both the beginning and the final cause of all knowledge, modernity holds, we believe in science as its creed. Every other yard sign confesses that science is real, but no one seems to really know if truth itself is real. This is why Professor Richard Weaver famously remarked, "Dialectic alone in the social realm is subversive." An approach of dialectic alone, like that of Socrates, even if it is very good dialectic, will tragically end in hemlock if one repeatedly acts to alienate his hearers. A man who only tears down without rebuilding anything at all is not a builder of culture, but a destroyer of it. True, a proper rhetorician will not hesitate to employ careful dialectic to demolish structurally unsound hovels if they are a danger to the polis of ideas. But he does not stop there. A good rhetorician will lead his fellow citizens in planting gardens and building grand colonnades over the rubble and empty lots. The forum will become more good, true, and beautiful as the result of his labors. Yet, while modernity rejects true rhetoric, it embraces sophistry. Today, literal logical fallacies are taught in the public schools as ethical marketing tactics. Even more dubious are the modern pop leadership concepts taught in many progressive schools and churches. Now, this is not true leadership, but rather it tends to set up individuals as their own ultimate leader, their own universal standard without any foundation in ethics, tradition, or even absolute truth. It turns individuals into their own God. Thus, it is actually egalitarianism. True leadership cannot be taught apart from wisdom, rhetoric, and the fundamental precepts of the classical liberal arts. Now, lest I fall into my own trap of hypocrisy, tearing down modernity without proposing a solution, I would like to offer how classical education, specifically Christian classical Lutheran education, might be an antidote for the ills of the age. Since dialectic has taught us that it is good to start with the definition, first we should ask, what is classical education? The classical society of the ancient Greeks actually had three divisions of education: the productive arts, the industrial arts, and the liberal arts. The first two of these were practical trades meant for servants, but the liberal arts, the height of education, was intended for the instruction of citizens, freemen, and their children. The ideal role of a citizen, the free person in the classical tradition, was threefold: legislative, executive, and judicial. Men were expected to be able to make good laws, to exercise leadership, and to be good judges, not only in the court of law, but to be at home in the court of ideas. This education equipped them to exercise their freedom and to achieve human excellence through the mastery of art. Over time, this tradition of education developed into the 7 liberal arts. Throughout the Middle Ages in Christendom, these 7 liberal arts were likened to the 7 pillars of the House of Wisdom from the Book of Proverbs. These arts may be divided into the trivium, the 3 tools of grammar, dialectic or logic, and rhetoric, and the subjects of the quadrivium, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music, which deal with the philosophy of number across time and space. The trivium deals mainly with words and ideas directly. Grammar, the most rudimentary of the arts, establishes the basic building blocks of language, allowing the student to express ideas. Grammar is a confession, a fundamental testament towards the existence of truth in its assertion, instruction, and memorization of facts, laying a solid foundation in thought, habit, and worldview upon which all further knowledge will be built. Dialectic, sometimes symbolized as a barking dog in medieval iconography, establishes proper form in arguments, giving a means to attack or to defend ideas. In establishing precision in the acts of the mind, logic involves understanding how the facts work together and make patterns, analyzing language for proper discernment and argumentation. It acquaints the student with reason and allows him to effectively move the mind of a listener, making a case for sense as opposed to nonsense. But a man does not think with his mind alone, but also with his heart. Through careful instruction in the 5 canons and the use of the 3 appeals, rhetoric provides all of the tools needed to move the heart of the hearer. In the classical era, rhetoric was defined by Quintilian as the good man speaking well. His definition emphasized the appeal of ethos. Now, through the Renaissance, rhetoric was defined by Sir Francis Bacon as the application of reason to imagination for the better moving of the will. To add the logos, in the modern world, we might speak on Christian rhetoric as the redeemed Christian speaking well for the good of his neighbor. The art of rhetoric is truly, as we have asserted, the most humane of all the humanities. Rhetoric itself involves the fields of ethics, poetics, history and religion, politics, law, psychology, and even dialectic. Now, as strange as it may sound, rhetoric even concerns itself with health and physical fitness. Rhetoric is a holistic discipline, and having a strong mind, a strong voice, and a healthy body all complement one another. In his Institutio or Oratoria, Quintilian speaks of the importance of taking walks and moisturizing your skin as part of rhetorical training. Good breathing control is necessary for projection and speaking well, and an audience is more likely to listen to the ideas of the man who takes good care of his health and his voice. Rhetoric is certainly the cornerstone of the trivium. According to Dorothy L. Sayers, the ideal student of the Middle Ages were doers of deeds and speakers of words. Classical education is an important part of the solution to the ills of this age because it trains up these doers and speakers as doctors of culture, men capable of diagnosing and treating those deadly illnesses of ideas, schemes, and ideologies which comprise the health or compromise the health of the body politic today. Rhetoric builds culture, and in organizing the hearts of men to one common good, it unites society. When combined with a solid catechesis in the Word and Sacraments, this kind of education prepares students not only for citizenship in the kingdoms of this world, but for citizenship in the kingdom of heaven. Our own meager good works do nothing to contribute to our salvation, and mastery of an art does not add to that. We are saved by grace through faith alone. In addition, using only rhetoric to combat the problems of this fallen world does not account for the problem of sin. However, the liberal arts, given alongside the study of the Holy Scriptures, equips all people in their vocations for the service of their neighbor and the glory of God. Ever since St. Paul's extensive use of rhetorical forms and devices and his inspired epistles, rhetoric has continued to prepare pastors, preachers, and servants of the word with tools to speak well, to aid them as they preach law and gospel, proclaiming Christ crucified for our sins and risen from the dead. Likewise, it aids the head of his household to teach the catechism to his family. With its poetic language, a natural but well-constructed style, and a great enduring value to all Christians, Luther's small catechism is a perfect rhetorical work, yet it is influenced by dialectic. Similarly, the Lutheran confessions themselves, the poetry of our hymns, and even parts of the liturgy are all rhetorical. These things are all treasured gifts to help us to live and confess what we believe, and to pass on to the faith to our future generations. Classical education trains the skills and knowledge necessary for true leadership, and rhetoric grants this ability to move hearts and minds. While this is a great power, we must always look for opportunities within our vocations to use these abilities wisely, speaking well for the good of our culture and society, out of love for our nature, out of love for our neighbor, to the glory of God. Thank you.
What is the purpose of classical education, and why is this so important for our students? Let us first begin by defining the term classical education. Classical education is the renewal of a traditional and historic liberal education that seeks to a robust study of the liberal arts, natural sciences, and great books. In today's society, history and school-related topics are entwined and marred with politics and false biased opinions. This happens because the government is in charge of these schools. They regulate and tell the schools what to teach its students. So, why is the government having total control over these public schools such a bad thing? Well, since the government has total control, they can ban and promote anything that they feel like is worth it. If the teacher does not agree with the government and tries to teach against or not with them, they could risk being fired or possibly put in jail. A great example of stuff being banned from schools are books. They banned the old classics such as Tom Sawyer because, well, it's racist. So instead of teaching these students the meaning, origin, and reason why those words exist and what happened, they are going to hide this kind of stuff from students. Everyone will eventually find out about those kinds of racial slurs and phrases. Schools should be willing to teach the students why these words are bad and where they originated from. Even though these schools ban books such as Tom Sawyer, they leave other books such as smut in the school libraries. How is smut better than learning about history and reasons why racial slurs exist? Classical education does not hide us from these kind of things, but teaches the students the reasonings behind these events and how to handle them. Because classical education gives these chances to the students learn to dig deeper and not judge before exploring both sides of the topic. The students are also taught to tie the topics relating to school to God. Not only does this make the student concentrate on the topics itself, but also everything around the topics. Truth, goodness, and beauty is definitely made very clear throughout the classical education. This type of education really prepares the mind of your students for the future as adults and productive humans to society. The students that take classical education can definitely distinguish the differences between the right and the wrong, to use that discernment and apply it to their daily lives and everything around them. So why is classical education so special? Classical education looks back in history and learns from the past. So why is learning from the past such a big deal, exactly? Learning from the past mistakes is the best way to learn, seeing the outcome and what had happened due to people's bad decisions and discernments. If the past was forgotten and not paid attention to, many of the exact same mistakes that had been made before will happen again and again. With classical education, students learn to observe the world around them in detail. They learn about the history and to use that to find those errors that are still happening in today's society. Not only does classical education teach you to do things for yourself, but it also teaches you how to use what you've learned to teach and help those around you. If you want your sons and daughters to be morally discerning and have a great time while learning those school-related topics, classical education is the way to go.
Why localism matters. Thomas Jefferson once said, "We in America do not have government by majority. We have government by the majority who participate." While one can find many things to disagree with Jefferson on, this is not one of them. Jefferson was a staunch proponent of self-governance and local autonomy. Jefferson's ideas in this field have been posthumously called Jeffersonian democracy. He was, of course, a key player in the founding of the United States and was considered to be one of the leaders of the Democratic Republicans, the opponents to the Federalists. Not to oversimplify this, the Federalists led by Hamilton, Adams, and others wanted a stronger federal government with federated states below. Jefferson, along with the other Democratic Republicans, were supporters of a weaker national government, allowing smaller states and localities to have more free reign over local affairs. This battle between supporters of a stronger federal government and those opposing it has to some extent woven a long thread through the history of the United States. Case law, constitutional amendments, and various laws passed by Congress over the decades have slowly eroded certain rights of the states. State and local governments have fewer and fewer discretionary powers. More authority was placed with the federal government. This power shift has had more of an effect on how our government works than I think many people know. More and more people focus their attention on national happenings because simply they correctly see that their local governments have little importance. The group of people who vote and participate in local governments seemingly get older with every election year. This can clearly be demonstrated by turnout figures. The 2021 Virginia House of Delegates election only had a 54% turnout. While it had a lot of media coverage, it did not hit the levels of the presidential election the year prior with 75% turnout. Fewer people care about their state and local politics compared to federal politics, and as such, fewer people vote. This is not a good development. Your local government still has a lot of influence over your day-to-day affairs. Your tax money goes to pay for services you use daily, and your council member can often determine the amount of money invested into your community. Your mayor, more likely than not, has a lot of executive authority over your city. Police, fire, health, waste disposal, your roads, and tax rates, all governed by local authorities, whether that be a county, city, township, or special district. There are plenty of reasons why this trend is happening. In terms of state politics, conservatives like to put blame on the 17th Amendment for state races that seemingly don't matter. They put blame on the 17th Amendment for the reason why state races don't matter anymore. Or they like to point to the scary big government programs. While a lot of these ideas point in the direction of the answer, I think the simple truth of the matter is that politics is increasingly national. All the attention is put on national races or other statewide races that get a lot of media attention. I'm not saying that focusing on these elections is bad. On the contrary, all I'm saying is that it often deprives local politics of any scrutiny. Oftentimes you'll have an uncontested race. Many times people don't even know who their local officials are. As I said earlier, these local officials have a lot of sway over your day-to-day life that you may not realize. They control planning boards, your utilities, where your taxes are spent, and have control over how prosperous your neighborhood is. Crime rates are important, and if your local authority doesn't care about it, well, your neighborhood is going to become unsafe. One of the silver linings to come out of 2020 with all the BLM riots and school board corruption that was exposed was that people started noticing that their local officials have a lot of influence. Your county sheriff, district attorney, mayor, city council, and school board members all have a lot of great sway over the policies that are put into effect. Caring for these positions, campaigning, voting, and spreading awareness would do an awful lot of good. If you want control over what your local government is doing, you need to participate. Harkening back to the Jefferson quote from the beginning of this, we in America do not have government by majority. We have government by the majority who participate. Your government will only represent the people who vote. Localism and local politics matter. Your community's well-being matters and is affected a lot by the composition of your local government. If you want a certain policy enacted or dislike a certain politician, the best way to deal with them is to actually participate in the system. If the only people participating in the local elections are liberal boomers, we're going to have a city government that caters to them. I understand some people just frankly don't care or don't want to bother with doing the research before going to the voting booth. That's not preferable, but honestly, who's going to force them to do that? The problem is that those same people then proceed to complain about this or that policy from their city or county. There's this common quip that you see around every election time. If you don't vote, you have no right to complain. I agree with that to some extent. If you don't bother to vote or participate in what your school board is doing, complaining about it won't do anything to fix it. Your mayor, city councilman, special district officers, local judges, and sheriffs dictate a lot about your life. Voting in these elections is the best way to have your voice represented. Local politics matters.
The COVID-19 virus has put a major dent in the world's economy and drastically changed the way most people live their lives, mainly because people have feared this disease ever since it officially became a global pandemic in the year 2020. Many countries instituted restrictions on travel and business facilities, and masks were expected to be worn indoors and outdoors. Borders were closed, people quit their jobs by the millions, tourism declined rapidly. All of this was happening and is still happening to an extent because of fear. People around the world have feared this virus ever since it started to spread, and the country of Taiwan is no exception. COVID-19 started spreading from Wuhan, China in December of 2019 and was declared a global pandemic about a month after that. I had been living with my family in Taiwan for almost 2 years when its government closed the borders and instituted mask mandates while in enclosed public spaces. But apart from that, the roughly 24 million people in the country were able to go about their daily lives. The COVID cases that had been brought into the country were quarantined, preventing further spread of the virus. Taiwan was still allowing citizens and residents to come into the country, but they were supposed to quarantine for 2 weeks, either at a government facility or somewhere at home by themselves. And a contact tracing system was instituted so that if someone within the island tested positive for COVID, the government could track down where they had been and alert those who had been around them. Taiwan's methods for keeping COVID at bay were largely successful and were praised by people all over the world. Taiwan imposed these measures in March of 2020, and while the rest of the world was reporting their thousands or millions of cases, Taiwan was sitting calmly in the background, minding its own business. From the time Taiwan closed down until April of 2021, the country ended up with a total of fewer than 500 cases and 11 deaths. The two reasons behind these amazing statistics are the culture of the Taiwanese people and fear. The Taiwanese people are a community-based people, meaning they are very willing to follow the restrictions and keep themselves and others from getting sick. Then May of 2021 came along and everything changed. Some people coming into the country decided to play fast and loose with quarantine, and COVID mushroomed. All of a sudden, Taiwan was getting hundreds of cases a day, which, relatively speaking, was a huge amount. The government's response, restricting almost everything they could. Masks became required outdoors as well as indoors, and quarantine was restricted to government facilities, and restaurants, businesses, and government institutions were shut down for 2 solid months. This system seemed to work because after those 2 months, the cases died down enough that the government felt it was okay to open up the inside of the island again, but the original restrictions were still there. Masks were to be worn whenever people went outside their homes, 14-day quarantine after coming into the country, as well as the contact tracing system. My family and I took a trip to the United States. However, when we came back in early February of 2022, things had not gotten much better. We had to quarantine for 2 weeks at a government facility, some of the family in one room and the rest in a second room, as well as having a week of self-management after we got back home. Throughout those 3 weeks, each member of the family was tested for COVID 7 times, just to make sure we were not bringing the virus into the country. It has been 2 years since the government first locked down the country, and COVID has just now broken loose in earnest. Only a month ago, the number of reported daily cases reached the thousands, and it has been climbing ever since. However, 99.8% of those cases are mild or asymptomatic. The question is, therefore, with currently reporting nearly 1 million local cases, why has the government not dropped quarantine? And with all the research and data that has been published since COVID broke out, why are the mask mandates still in place? Why are people still worried about this virus? The answer is fear. Fear of getting the virus and fear of losing power and popularity. The Asian mindset of the Taiwanese people is one of consensus and obedience to the government. That mindset, which kept COVID more or less under wraps for 2 years, is the same mindset that is keeping the restrictions around today. Put simply, people are afraid of being infected with COVID. Some people even wear masks inside their home. Almost everyone is fed up with the restrictions, but the underlying factor is that they do not want to get sick. There have been a few people who have spoken against the restrictions, but it has not been enough to sway public opinion. Dr. Chun, head of the Central Epidemic Command Center here in Taiwan, is a dentist by occupation, and if COVID were allowed to be a part of life, he would go back to being just a face in the crowd. He is the one putting all the restrictions in place, and for some strange reason, people view him as their savior from this virus. Thankfully, the Taiwanese people have started to lose their fear of COVID, mainly due to the example China is setting with its attempts to eradicate the virus. Even as the number of cases continues to increase by the thousands every day, the Taiwanese government is continuing to open up the country. Quarantine, which is no longer required to be in a government facility, has dropped to 7 days, and there is talk of reducing the number of days even further. Discussions about removing the mask mandate are also taking place, as well as allowing regular tourists into the country again. After 2 years of fear-driven living, people are finally beginning to realize that it does not work. Fear is a very powerful emotion, but there comes a time when people need to say enough is enough. COVID has been around in the world for more than 2 years now, with most countries in the world back to business as usual. Quarantine and mask mandates and all the other restrictions have their place, but since professionals have discovered that COVID is not something most people should worry about, the restrictions should be taken down and people allowed to live their lives again. If you are worried, get the vaccination and then stop worrying about something out of your control. Living in fear damages not only yourself, but those around you as well. 2.5 years have passed since this virus broke out, and it is high time for people to leave their rabbit holes, or in some cases, climb down from their pedestals and get on with life.